Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. President Trump has named federal appeals court Judge Brett Kavanaugh as his nominee to the Supreme Court. During Monday night's announcement at the White House, President Trump said Kavanaugh had a, quote, sharp and fine legal mind. The president also highlighted Kavanaugh's involvement in his church and community. While accepting the president's nomination, Kavanaugh discussed his judicial philosophy, talked about his family, and praised the president.
Mr. President, thank you. Throughout this process, I've witnessed firsthand your appreciation for the vital role of the American judiciary. No president has ever consulted more widely or talked with more people from more backgrounds to seek input.
For some legal analysis, let's bring in CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford in Washington. So, Jan, we saw Roe v. Wade protesters outside the Supreme Court ahead of the nomination. Do we know where Kavanaugh stands on the issue of abortion rights?
Well, he said in his appellate court nomination hearing that he would respect precedent, and he considered that settled law, for principles of stare decisis. But that was just an appellate court judge. I mean, we don't know how he would rule as a Supreme Court justice. And abortion will be front and center of these nomination proceedings and the fight that leads up to it. I wouldn't expect him to answer it. I mean, every single nominee that has a confirmation hearing, whether they're on the left or the right, whether you're a Justice Kagan or a Justice Ginsburg or Justice Sotomayor, or whether you're Alito, Gorsuch, and now Judge Kavanaugh, basically says the same thing, which is you can't express an opinion on a case that's not before you. I mean, it would be totally inappropriate. So you're going to see senators really push him on that, and they're also going to say, oh, they're so sure. You're going to hear senators on the left saying they're so sure that he's going to overturn Roe, that it's the key vote, because Justice Kennedy had voted to had refused to overturn Roe versus Wade. But I think that you just have to also keep in mind there's only one justice on the Supreme Court right now that we know for sure would vote to overturn Roe versus Wade, and that's Justice Clarence Thomas. We don't know how the Chief Justice would vote. We don't know how Justice Alito would vote. We don't know how Justice Gorsuch would vote. You still got to get 4 more votes. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that a lot of this, I think, is exaggerated. I think what's much more likely is that the conservative justices, a 5-justice majority, will continue to allow restrictions on abortion rights, as Justice Kennedy was willing to do, but stop short of overturning it.
Jan, there had been some criticism of Kavanaugh from the right, that some had expressed concerns that he was not conservative enough. But now that the president has chosen Brett Kavanaugh, one would expect those conservatives to just sort of close ranks.
Well, yes, I think to a certain extent, the social conservatives were the ones who had a lot of kind of concerns because Judge Kavanaugh had not taken the most bold position on some cases that they had hoped he would be more, as they said, pro-life. And so they were somewhat troubled by some of his decisions, or at least one in particular on that issue. But, I think when you look at his qualifications, and we know this president tends to exaggerate, it's hard to argue with the president when he says there is no one more qualified and he deserves it. His qualifications are sterling. He's got the elite academic credentials. He's got a judicial record. His legal writing is excellent. So you may disagree with his philosophy, his ideology, but it's hard to quarrel with his qualifications.
At the same time, Kavanaugh worked extensively in the Bush White House, and given the president's relationship with the Bush family, how surprising was it that the president went ahead and decided to choose Brett Kavanaugh?
That was one concern of some of Judge Kavanaugh's supporters, was that he wasn't going to want to put someone on the Supreme Court who had been in the Bush world. There's not a lot of love lost between President Trump and the Bushes. But at the end of the day, I think there was so much support for Judge Kavanaugh in the conservative legal community, not just in Washington, but outside of Washington, too, because he does have that record. And he has written quality opinions that people may not agree with his philosophy or his approach, but there's no question that he is highly, highly qualified for the Supreme Court. So now the question is going to be a battle over whether or not, with Democrats, whether he should be on the court. And there's not a lot they can do. They kind of squandered the use of the filibuster to try to block Justice Gorsuch to replace Justice Scalia, and so that allowed Republicans to kind of do away with the filibuster, as Democrats had done earlier for appellate court nominations. So now they really are going to be essentially hoping that they can peel off a Republican like a Susan Collins to vote no, and I just think that's highly unlikely. He is not someone who has this kind of inflammatory record. There were other contenders who I think would have raised more red flags for Senator Collins than Judge Kavanaugh will. So I think that what you're going to see is a lot of, hand-wringing and characterizing his record as something that it's extreme, but it's going to be pretty hard to back that up.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, Jan. Based on Judge Kavanaugh's expansive record, do we know of any issues already coming to light from people who would oppose his nomination?
Sure. I mean, you're going to hear Democrats, and Democrats already are saying that he is hostile to women's rights, that he is anti-business, he's in the pocket of corporations, that he has, views about expansive presidential power, he's too close to the White House. So, yes, you're going to hear all of those arguments. The question is going to be, when you actually look at the opinions and look at his decisions, the president gets to nominate a conservative for the Supreme Court. And as we saw with Justice Gorsuch, Democrats portrayed him as this extreme nominee. And the argument that the majority leader, Mitch McConnell, was able to make to the Republicans in the Senate was, if we cannot get behind Justice Gorsuch, there's no one, if we can't get him confirmed, there's no one that Democrats are going to accept. And I think that you're going to hear that argument again this time. Judge Kavanaugh is kind of a candidate, in terms of a conservative at a central casting. He's had that record like we talked about. He's got the experience. He clerked on the Supreme Court. So he's not some kind of, out of the blue crazy pick that it's going to be hard, I think, for Democrats to get traction on him. Although I do think his time in the Bush White House and working for the independent counsel, Ken Starr, is going to be a focal point of those hearings, as it was during his appellate court hearings. And Democrats blocked him for 3 years on the appellate court. I think what's really interesting about this pick is it shows that President Trump is going to just take it straight to the Democrats. He's not going to shy away from a fight. This was the nominee that was considered the most qualified, that was considered this kind of conservative intellectual powerhouse. And he could have picked someone safer and someone, that didn't have this kind of record, may not have been quite as predictable. And he was like, no, I'm ready. Let's bring it, because that's what he said he was going to do. And you saw him tonight say, I promised I would do this, and I've delivered.
All right. CBS News Chief Legal Correspondent Jan Crawford in Washington. Jan, thanks so much. Really great to have your perspective.